Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Illuminate session entitled Compliance in a Cloud World Made Easier. In this session, we're going to do a deep dive into the world of compliance. Hopefully, you'll walk away with some interesting things that will make your compliance life a little bit easier. My name is Chas Clawson. I'm the field CTO in the security business unit here in Sumo Logic. And I've been in the IT and security space for about 20 years now. 10 of those years have really been focused in security operations, SOC consulting. I'm living in the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area, so I've worked with a lot of the three-letter agencies in their SOC practices. And I've also spent a few years at the NSA doing red team offensive security testing and spent some time with an MSSP consulting and building a practice for dedicated to Fortune 500 companies and really around that managed response practice. So today, like I said, we're going to do a deep dive into the world of compliance. I know a lot of times this is a topic that maybe is less exciting, less sexy, and maybe causes a little bit of a grumble. But we'll try and keep this engaging for you guys and make your compliance challenges a little bit better. So first of all, where does compliance fit, right? So there's the people, process, and technologies that you have within an enterprise. And what we say compliance, or sometimes referred to as continuous compliance, should be at the core of your security practice, right? So the reason that we say it's continuous compliance now, and that's kind of a more popular term these days, really because it is an evolving, loop, right? So as you're improving your business controls and your processes and your documentation, there should be that feedback loop, right? Because the attack and the threat landscape's always changing, and the compliance and the regulations need to keep pace with what the adversaries are doing. Um, the other thing to think about, and it's kind of illustrated in this diagram, compliance is really a minimum standard. The goal really is to level all businesses up to that minimal standard. And we do that through enforcement, right? Through those regulations and adherence to those regulations and audits. Um, but really, you should think of it as just that, a minimum set of requirements. And we're seeing a lot of companies take it and then lean in, right? Lean into more modern approaches like zero trust security. Ultimately, the goal is the same, right? That protection of data, accountability via audits and via assessments, ensuring that you have proper incident response and recovery, and ultimately that you're doing proper reporting, right? That you've got these audit artifacts, that you're adhering to these compliance standards with your logging, so that if in worst case scenario there is a breach, you're still, you're still covered with, you've done your due diligence. So what are some of the different compliance frameworks? If you're in this space already, you probably know it all too well, but there's quite a long list, right? And this list is not comprehensive. There's quite a few that aren't on this list, like GDPR, a lot of state regulations like CCPA, California Consumer Protection Act. A lot of those type of regulations are not listed here, but these are some of the more popular frameworks. Sumo Logic, of course, because we're a cloud SaaS provider, we're very familiar with these, both from providing services out to our customers, but because we ourselves have to be compliant, right? As a cloud company that's storing critical data. And for example, the NIST 853, that FedRAMP, we're a FedRAMP authorized cloud provider. And if you're not familiar with that, it really entails just many controls that we have to go through in that extensive audit process in order for us to achieve that FedRAMP stamp of approval. Um, so again, I want to underscore these frameworks really are just a minimum standard, but a lot of thought and a lot of community feedback goes into them. So before you kind of write them off as a checkbox, keep in mind that they're quite well researched. And I included a slide here to just illustrate that point. Um, as you can see here, this is just, I think it was last March, the PCI DSS version 4 came out. And this takes years to develop, right? So they open it up for feedback, the community, they go through many iterations of drafts until finally it's released. And then even at that point that it's released, you're going to be running it in tandem with like the previous version. So again, these compliance frameworks are well thought out, and they're really worth looking into and taken very seriously. One of the challenges that companies face is, that staff shortage. Do you have an entire compliance team? Who wears the compliance hat within the enterprise? And it is a complex thing to wrangle. One solution to this, and it's happened as customers have gone through this digital transformation and shifting to the cloud, is taking some of that responsibility and shifting it away to vendors and cloud providers. And so as you do that, then you remove some of the burden, some of the operate and maintain overhead that comes from running your own systems and running your own software. So in this session, we're going to just use AWS as an example of how shifting some of that responsibility to the providers can actually be a load off your shoulders. And so that shared responsibility that you're probably familiar with really equates to some ways in shared compliance. So on this diagram, really what we're capturing here is everything in orange is the responsibility of the cloud provider, in this case, AWS. So if you were running a lot of these solutions in-house, right, on-premise, within a data center, right, within your physical building or infrastructure, a lot of this you would be responsible for. But because everything is now running in the cloud, AWS is going to start sharing some of that responsibility. But there's always going to be that demarcation, is where does their responsibility and ultimately their liability stop, and where does yours begin? And that's really on a continuum. So you can look at it as, a sliding scale, and it really just depends on how far you are in that digital transformation. The more you move into the cloud, moving from, a container-based architecture to, maybe a serverless or microservice-based architecture, that moves the needle a little bit further to the right. And so that's shifting some of that shared responsibility over to the cloud provider. Now, what happens during this digital transformation and is one of the primary drivers is not only does your compliance responsibility drop, but also your costs, right? You're leveraging those economies of scale. You're no longer having to, procure, physical equipment, but also all of those less considered aspects, such as compliance, right? um, because it is a shared responsibility model, now a lot of that compliance overhead and that, the internal audits that AWS does, which you're not necessarily privy to, but they're constantly doing code review and assessments against their infrastructure. You no longer have to do that. And all the way to the far right here, you can see on this slide is the full SaaS model. So when you're working with companies like Sumo Logic, us being a cloud SIM, a cloud SaaS solution, you would no longer have to worry about, is my data safe in the cloud? Because we've already gone through all of these very robust compliance checks. And so you know that if you're storing your data in the Sumo Logic security data lake in the cloud, that it's going to be safe, right? We've gone through all of these different checks and controls so that you no longer have to. But regardless of where you are in that journey, there's still going to be some serious challenges that are worth considering, and some of those here are captured. Um, so the current approach doesn't scale to handle cloud workloads. So if you're early in that cloud migration process, make sure that as you're looking to where you want to be tomorrow, that you're bringing tools into your stack that are cloud native, right? That are scalable, that are able to have that cloud to cloud integration and communication. That's really going to save you a lot of headaches. So um, that's definitely one aspect. The other thing is cloud technology should have a very quick time to value, right? Because they're cloud native, we spin up Sumo Logic instances within just a few minutes, and you have a full environment to start bringing logs into. Compare and contrast that to maybe having to go through change control and racking and stacking equipment. It's a very different world. Um, the other thing is when you're looking at solutions to solve some of these compliance needs, make sure that ease of use and usability is considered, right? So do a pretty good review of the products themselves. At the end of the day, if the product's too difficult to use, if you're bringing in your auditors, and you're doing that review, it can really slow you down. So um, the SIM itself is really a central component to a good compliance program, primarily because it's where all of the audit logs and the artifacts are stored. So this is just a simple diagram here of what it would look like to do from soup to nuts building out a compliance program. But first you have to define your audit policy, and that could be everything from the actual logging policy on the individual systems, identifying which critical systems need to be sending logs into that central log management platform. But then it does touch on processes and people as well. But we'll focus a little bit more on the technology side of things. But once you start collecting logs, you're going to be doing the analytics. You're going to be alerting on that through ideally a real-time correlation engine or some sort of alert logic. Then you're going to be doing some response. So that's where your SOC team comes into play, where you're managing perhaps a 24/7 watch floor that's responding, doing that incident response. And then it comes back around to reporting and then archiving. So there's a lot of regulations these days, and it changes pretty rapidly. But how long do you have before you're legally required to report an incident or a breach? And when that happens, do you have all of the different log artifacts that you're required to? Have you done your due diligence in your controls? For example, capturing those authentication logs and all the different audit streams, so that when you're doing that report, you can understand what is what's the blast radius, what's the magnitude of the breach, what systems and user accounts were affected, right? That's all on you to be able to prove. Um, so fast forward now to what does that look like in a cloud environment, right? So if you're fully enabled in the cloud and you're running, all of your different applications in the cloud, and your identity and access management's in the cloud, and your file sharing is all done in the cloud, it's a little bit different. Um, Part of the problem is, like, if you just take AWS alone, there's you know hundreds of different services that they offer. So how do you know which of those different services, each that perhaps have their own audit trail of events, are you required to monitor? um, and again, you're wanting to do that minimum compliance checkbox, but ultimately, for your own business operations and risk reduction, you do want to increase your observability of all systems, right? So you want to take what the minimum standard is and then probably go above and beyond that, because an audit or a compliance framework may not necessarily care if your system is down, right? And increased observability and being able to do that root cause analysis and get those systems back online quicker, of course, is critical for the business use case. So here's just a kind of anecdotal slide here showing all of the different AWS services and how they might interact. So how do you even begin to bring all of this different telemetry into a system similar to Sumo Logic? Well, the good news is we have done a really good job making it easy. And I'll just share one example. If you go to the Amazon Marketplace and you look up the Sumo Logic Quick Start, it really provides kind of a three-step process to identify all of the different AWS services that you have, and then ultimately bring those logs and that telemetry back into Sumo Logic. So I'll show briefly, we won't do too deep a dive into this particular topic, but first you go to that AWS Quick Start. It'll create the CloudFormation stack with the Sumo Logic template. So you're going to provide just a few different, the access ID and key in order for the two systems to interoperate. And then you go down the laundry list, right? Do you have guard duty? Do you have VPC flow logs? Would you like to install all of this content? Yes, 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 down the list. We really could not make it any easier. Um, and at that point, once you finalize that, all of the data sources are automatically created and they're tied back to their AWS services. So it really is just a three-step process. And I often joke in IT, there is no easy button. This is probably as close to that easy button as you can get. What does this ultimately mean for you and your end users and your stakeholders within the environment? You're going to get instant visibility of all the AWS things, right? Each one of the different Amazon services is going to have a different pre-built set of dashboards, searching, alerting. All of that is provided for you out of the box. So again, that's really one of the reasons that Sumo Logic is a pretty powerful solution when it comes to compliance. So what does it mean to actually use Sumo Logic as one of your core, alerting and monitoring solutions? These are just a few examples that I pulled of what we would be doing for you and with all of that data that we're bringing in. Um, Compliance goes way beyond just detection, right? It goes way beyond just bringing in logs and running that real-time correlation and that alerting against those logs. But at the same time, that's a core part of any compliance program. So are you tracking all of your authentications, for example, the login failures, if there's a malware outbreak, if you're running like EDR solutions, or different point solutions, where are you collecting and alerting on those? The SIM has always been kind of that central anchor to cross correlate across the entire stack, right? So that's why it kind of sits centrally across all of this different information. So here we go with kind of a summary of what Sumo Logic does. It's a cloud-native data monitoring solution that enables cost-effective, rapid compliance readiness for your cloud and on-premise environments. So it does check all those boxes of detection, and it provides an out-of-the-box investigation workflow. If you already have one, like a ServiceNow perhaps, we can integrate with that. If you don't have one, Sumo Logic has one built in. We also have the Sumo Logic Cloud SOAR, which includes that automated remediation and enrichment component. And then, because it is a cloud solution, you can store logs in the cloud for, 5,000 days. Really, it's just you set your own compliance. And that retention is actually one of the smaller parts of our overall price. Just for the sake of time, we'll keep moving forward here a little bit. But you can also use Sumo Logic as a workbench. So here you can see, in this case, it's the CMMC. But what you're really doing is creating a single pane of glass for the auditors to come in and then hot link back to any of the different panels or artifacts that might be important to them. The other thing that's worth mentioning is with Sumo Logic, it's unlimited users, unlimited dashboards. Those dashboards can be shared. If you explicitly allow it with controls, you can also share that out to your auditors or stakeholders. So it becomes very easy for you to use Sumo Logic as that central reporting mechanism. The last thing we'll kind of close out here is, again, at Sumo Logic, we've gone through, we know your pain is probably the best way to put it. These are all of the different compliance frameworks that we ourselves have gone through. We'd love to, put on our consulting hat and help you kind of work through some of the similar challenges that we've gone through ourselves. But we do spend, like it says, $2 million on compliance annually. Hopefully, your budget is not quite as excessive as that. Um, but again, we do use Sumo Logic in-house ourselves, of course, to meet a lot of our compliance needs, and we'd love to help enable you guys to get as much value out of the Sumo Logic platform as possible. With that, we'll go ahead and end this session, and thank you guys for joining.